Storytelling. We all have probably told stories in many contexts in our lives, to children that we know, to adults. We tell stories every day when we say what happened to us on the bus, when we just talk about our day. That's a form of storytelling. We remember stories that we were told as children. They are probably a huge part of us. We feel like we are formed by those stories in a way. And how we tell Bible stories and why we tell Bible stories can be incredibly important in how children's faith is shaped. And we look at it in the same way that we would look at any other part of collective worship in a school or worship in a church. Because whatever our children's programs are doing, if we are forming faith, it is a form of worship. So we ask the same questions we'd probably ask of prayers or music or any kind of worship, and they're the same whether we're in person or online. So we ask, how do we do it well? When we are telling a story, when we are transmitting something, when we're the leaders and children are kind of watching or receiving, how do we do that well? How do we do that well in person? How do we do that well online? But then we also need to remember that part of the role of the church and part of the role of school leaders is to empower children as leaders. So how do we empower children as leaders and as storytellers? How do we equip children to tell stories, again, both in person and online? And so I think those questions go back to the main question of why we tell stories, what role storytelling plays in worship, in faith formation, what it does to us. And so here are some random thoughts on why story is important, and Bible stories specifically. Stories help us make meaning out of the world. Very often we reach to a story to explain something that's going on. A lot of stories are deliberately designed this way. Fables, for example, are very they dictate a moral. They show what the world means. But even fairy tales, novels, films, they help us make meaning out of the world and make meaning out of our lives. Stories create a group identity. If any of you are involved in any fandom, then you have probably seen this. I was the right age for an enormous amount of my friends in school and university to be in Harry Potter fandom. There's Marvel fandom. There's Hamilton fandom. And that group identity, being a fan of that story, feeling that story is important to you, shapes that group identity. And when it's a faith story, then it shapes who you are as a people. It says, this is where we've come from. This is our story. This is what has happened to us. We do this as part of our national myth making as well. And a lot of the sort of wrangling you see over the way we as a nation adapt the sort of mythologizing that's happened about the Blitz, and try to figure out what that means and what our role in World War II really was and what that means to us as a people, and where we come from and what's happened to us. That's that process of group identity. The other side of that process, we create this group identity. We are part of that story. That story has made us who we are as a people. But then we also expand our own individual identity to include the story. So it shapes the group, but it also shapes the individual. So we come to see that story as part of our identity. I spent a good amount of my adolescent years as a major fan of the musical Les Miserables. And so I had to have the t-shirts that had the logos on it. I had to have all the different cast recordings. I wanted to talk to people about it when I was getting to know them, so that they would know this was an important part of who I was. My identity was very wrapped up in that story, and it was part of who I am. And when I look back at what's shaped me as a person, that's still a huge part of that time in my life. And I'm sure every single one of you can probably think of one or two stories that served a similar role in shaping your individual identity at different parts of your life. For the faith story, the story explains what God is like and what God's relationship with humanity has been. So if people want to know, who is this God person that you keep talking about? Who is this Jesus person that you keep talking about? Then we tell a story to explain what they're like. And God does this as well. Very often we see throughout the Hebrew scriptures, God starts off by saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. So God refers to that story to explain what God is like and what God's relationship with humanity has been. What's Jesus like? Well, here are some of the things that he did. Here's the story of his death and resurrection. Here are some of the most important things he did during his ministry. I tell you those stories so that you can understand what God is like, because it's through those stories that we have come to know God. And finally, stories help explain our practice. Very often, again, throughout the Hebrew scriptures, you see God's people doing things deliberately so that children will start asking questions. So the adults start doing some weird stuff, and the kids go, wait a minute, this is some weird stuff you're doing. Why are you doing that? And the adults go, well, funny you should ask. Let me tell you a story that explains that. So you create the opportunity for the child to ask the question that allows you to tell the story. So you have Joshua crossing the Jordan with the Israelites, and he has them stop and just put up a whole bunch of stones for no reason whatsoever. And everyone's going, why are we putting up these stones? For no reason. And Joshua says, it's because when the children see them, they'll ask, why are these stones here? And then you can tell them about how God brought us out of Egypt and how God led us through the desert and into the land of promise. But they'll see the stones and they'll ask about it, and that will give you the opportunity for telling the story. Happens at the Passover Seder. It's become ritualized, but it starts out as a child's natural curiosity about why you're doing things tonight differently from regular nights. And we do it at the Eucharistic prayer. We start telling the story. On the night before he died for us, our Lord Jesus Christ took bread. And so that's why we're taking bread now, and that's why we're breaking it and sharing it. We tell the story to explain why we do what we do. So it's hugely formational, these stories. They create the individual's identity as a person of faith. They explain who God is. They start making meaning out of the world, and they form our communities as people of faith when we claim that story as our own. And it's been difficult the last 6 months to do all the things we normally do, including storytelling. So we may have had an excellent bag of tricks that served us really well, and we may have had to completely redo it. There may have been different levels of success with that. So I'm going to ask for about the next 6 or 7 minutes if we can share any tips that we may have picked up over the last 6 months about specifically online storytelling, what's worked and what hasn't. And if there have been any opportunities for children to be biblical storytellers online. Is there anything that's worked and anything that hasn't?
I mean, I think I did playing some YouTube videos and intercepting them and giving and allowing children to respond. So screen sharing, so ability to tell stories that in which, say for example, in our context, which was an old church hall and with zero Wi-Fi, I suppose it's a little bit more zazzy now compared to what it would have been like. So that, I suppose, would have been a benefit. And but yeah, I suppose you don't have that immediate feedback that you would have it's not always, seeing people in the person does help to, you know, keep the momentum going with the stories and stuff. But there's certainly good bits and bad bits. I don't know if I've actually used children in an actual story. But you mentioning that we're having all of these things, doing scavenger hunts and stuff have been on Zoom meetings and stuff have been definitely integral, but it's always got to do with what story it is. But I do actually think that now maybe it might be worthwhile, even if it isn't quite, you know, a pen, even if it's not quite a what you're expecting it to be, it can be. It doesn't have to be exactly the right thing. So no.
And there's also, I mean, there is the fact that we need to consider, if we're inviting children to use things they have at home, there may be wildly different things that children do and don't have at home.
Yeah.
We can't assume everyone has Lego or Playmobil or something. But there are two things that I've heard that basically can be done regardless of a family's circumstance. There's what you've got in your recycling bin. So you can make stuff out of that. And there's sticks and rocks. Most people can get a stick and some rocks, and the sticks can be people, the rocks can be people, the sticks and rocks can be landscapes, and then you can walk your people around them. Because that reminds me again, everybody's got their body, so you can use your body and your voice as well. So even if we can't assume, sadly, that every family even has a pen and paper at home, there are probably things that are universally usable.
Yeah, because we did for a local church, we were doing a lunch club during lockdown every 2 weeks, and just for half an hour. So we would obviously send out a Zoom link, and then you know the parents had to be present. They didn't have to sit with their children as long as they're in the same room, but most parents were engaging with the children. And we'd prep in advance, saying to them obviously what they needed to bring and that. So ours was more about presenting like a lunch club and a story and a theme, but then having a craft. So what we did was open it up at the end that the children can be engaging with the crafts and being able to chat to their friends at the same time. So it wasn't so much storytelling. We were doing the storytelling, but they engaged in that way. And I think, like you were saying about the recycling stuff, we try to do things that they could get easily, you know, that anyone could really access at home. I'm just trying to think what else. I know I've heard of people doing like a messy church even, and getting the kids to run off and find something in the house, you know, and they had to go like a scavenger hunt thing like you were saying. But in terms of storytelling, I'm just trying to think how much I've engaged, because what I've been finding is we also, with the work I do, a lot of it we're presenting, and we're leaving a lot for either the teachers to do, or when we were doing stuff online for homeschooling or schools to use, we were obviously relying on the teachers or the parents to engage with their children, because we gave them some practical application stuff that they could make together or engage in activity, or so I'm just trying to think. And then
you talk about facilitating the parents and those at home to take on part of the role that you normally would. And
giving them the resources and keeping it simple, like even the way we did it, because we knew some people wouldn't be able to print off potentially, but at least they could read, if they had a computer, they could read it off the screen. Oh yeah, then another thing we did with, I know the church I go to, we did the children, we encouraged the children, after we had a little slot with the children with crafts or whatever, then if they wanted to do any, you know, send any pictures back, or do, and actually some of the children sent little videos and they reenacted the story they'd heard, and they put their own little props together and did their own little thing, and they pretended they were doing like a Sunday class. So it was really wonderful to see them engaging, and then hearing their interpretation of the story and what they got from it and what they gleaned from it. So it was really lovely to see that. That was really lovely to see, actually, because sometimes you're not sure how much, you know, what they're getting, what's going in sometimes, but when you hear them come back to you, it's amazing what they've actually absorbed and what's been important to them, what they've taken from it. Yeah, so. Absolutely.
And I imagine a possible next step from that, from them hearing the story and then retelling it, could be giving them the story in advance and then them being the ones to tell it to everyone.
Yes.
And we had one church in our diocese where that kind of naturally happened with their family service. At the start of lockdown, the children kind of staged a coup. They did a takeover of the storytelling and they said, let us do it. And they were saying, actually, they felt more confident doing that from their living rooms than they would have done getting up in front of everyone at church. So in a way, there's kind of been a possible bonus in that this is a safe place for children to take more risks, whereas getting up in front of the whole school or in front of the whole church isn't. But then, you know, they could make a video at home that could then be shown in church or at school, where they wouldn't be sort of taking the risk of standing up front. And so this has kind of given us the push to think a bit more creatively, and then we can think about how we take those what we might have started to do differently into the hybrid place we find ourselves now. Anything else?
Not so much a personal experience from me in trying to, you know, share a story online or have others do, but particularly when schools, you know, couldn't meet together as they would want to, particularly at the start of the summer term. It was amazing just seeing how powerful it was for school leaders to record that collective worship, you know, and part of that would be a story, and just seeing how that united and kept that kind of school community feel together, where there was that risk that it could have been like, you know, dissipated, but, you know, wherever it was done, you know, that community stuck together around their vision and their values, and it was really amazing. It's quite inspirational to see. Absolutely.
And one thing, I'm a bit of a spoiler alert. In a bit, we're going to be talking about what we remember from stories that we really loved as children. And one thing that often comes back from that conversation is the relationship you had with the person who read you that story or who told you that story. And so the reassurance of a beloved teacher or Sunday school leader or whomever reading you a story in lockdown, that preserves that element of it, that relationship, even though the format is different. Right, I'm going to go back to sharing the screen and, well, actually no, because the next thing, it was just saying the next thing we're going to do is some storytelling. So there's no point sharing that. So I'm going to now move over here because I've set up a story space. And it's very simple and straightforward. I've just got a cardboard box here that I've covered in a white cloth. And then I've got a white background, which is a sketch pad on its side with a box behind it. And I've had to move my lamp so that it's over there, just next to this storytelling space, so that you get a bit better light. And I can move the computer so that the storytelling space takes up the majority of the screen. Because if you want to engage in the world of the story, you don't want it to be just this tiny little bit at the bottom of the screen and my face being most of it. So you can get out your 3 figures as well. And we're going to stop the story at different points. And I'm going to ask what the characters might be thinking or feeling. And you can move your characters, your 3 objects, as things happen in the story to show how you think they might be standing or lying down or sitting or moving. And it might be the same as mine, or it might be different. That's okay. Your story is yours. This is a story about families. We may feel some very strong emotions during this story because our families might be like the family in this story in some ways. And this is a story that Jesus told called a parable. There once was a man, said Jesus, with 2 sons. One day, the younger son said, I want my share of the inheritance now. So the father gave him the money, and he went away. And I wonder what the father might be thinking or feeling now. I wonder what the younger son might be thinking or feeling now. I wonder what the older son might be thinking or feeling now. And if anyone wants to share how you've set up your people, your objects, to show this part of the story, you can do that now as well. Robin, would you like to tell us about why you've set them up that way?
I've got, here's the father.
Mm-hmm.
Here is the son that stayed with him, and here is the son that went away. And it was quite fun putting him as far as I possibly could. And yeah, it was first it was an animal, but then I thought, no, it needs to be a human, and it actually stands up quite nicely. So quite an interesting. I've just been looking at the it does actually look more like a human being now, less than a cat. Yes.
And why did you choose to put the younger son as far away as possible?
Well, I suppose because, you know, he's kind of written himself off from the family. He's not interested in what's going on, and he just wants to go off and have a good time, spend his inheritance. And but he's within arm's reach, so that when he does need to come back, he can come back.
Within arm's reach. I like that phrase. Thank you. Anyone else want to share? You don't have to, but you can.
I really like that, Robin. I've gone for I decided that with the younger son, I just wanted to, whereas they were face to face, it was just like an abrupt turn, just kind of, I'm turning away from you, pursuing my own thing. And I would, if I could move the father's head, I would have done, but it would have been kind of looking down, a little bit upset, a little bit shocked, aggrieved, perhaps. So that's what I went for.
Yeah. Well, I just made a quick Lego mismatch or something. And that's the dad with his arms open, and this is the older brother, and this is the younger brother. And I sort of felt like this, like the same thing a bit with Ryan, like if I could make the dad's head bow a bit once his son left, because he must have been, you know, sad in his heart. And I was thinking about the older brother. I was thinking sort of maybe him feeling kind of angry towards his younger brother, feeling like his younger brother was really ungrateful for maybe what his dad's provided for him all his life, you know, and a bit of anger towards his brother, I felt in my heart. And then with the younger brother, I sort of was imagining him with his back away from his family, but because his character's kind of colorful and lively, it made me think of someone young and crazy and wanting to have fun, and he wanted to go live his own life, you know, and he sort of turned his back on his family, not really appreciating what he had, but thinking he's going to a new life to have fun and enjoy himself, if you see what I'm saying, using all his wealth. So him turning away and going off. I don't know if that, so.
Thank you. So when the younger son left, he spent all his money in almost no time on drinking and gambling. But a famine came to the country where he had gone to live. He grew hungry, so hungry he could have eaten the pig swill. That was his job now, looking after pigs. He decided to go home. I will say to my father, I have done wrong. Treat me like one of the servants. I wonder what the younger son is thinking and feeling now. I wonder what the father is thinking and feeling now. So the younger son started going back towards his home. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and ran out, flung his arms around his neck, and kissed him. "Bring the best robe," he said, "and kill the fatted calf. We are going to have a feast. The son I thought was dead has come home alive." I wonder what the younger son is thinking and feeling now. I wonder what the father is thinking and feeling now. All this time, the older son had been working on the farm. When he heard the music and dancing, he was jealous. "I've worked for you all these years," he grumbled to his father, "and you never held a feast for me." I wonder what the older brother is thinking and feeling now. I wonder if any of you would like to share how you've set your figures up for this part of the story.
So I've gone for the father with hands up in jubilation, really, really excited. Taking his cloak off to give to the youngest son that had wandered away, wandered back. So they're kind of at an angle to each other, facing each other. And then I've got the older brother who is quite angry and upset, just making a bit of a scene of it. So yeah, trying to get in, trying to squeeze in for some attention and some, you know, what's going on here. I feel there's an injustice that's gone on.
Yours is animated. I like how you've given them movements.
Dynamic.
Does anyone have any questions about how Ryan set up his story? Trish, you're on mute.
Yeah, I like the way he's brought his characters to life, like even his father raising his arms and giving him the cloak, sort of made it quite real, you know what I mean, made it more interactive. And then seeing the little monkey, the older brother being in a strop kind of thing, it made it quite, like you can imagine someone having a bit of a busy fit, not quite literally, but you know what I mean, it's sort of, you can imagine it, what's happening in the scene, how they're all feeling in different ways. Yeah.
The father turned. So, go ahead.
Anyway, so I was just going to say, sorry, jumping in. I was going to say that with mine, when my little figurine was at his furthest point, I found a random scrunched up Tesco receipt, and that's what he was busy eating when he was. So I've cheated. I've got a fourth item for my.
I cheated a little. I brought pigs in.
Little ambiance situation here. And then when the father came, now my father's quite, you know, is very extravagant. So he came and he was, to say, kissing the son. seeing the son like that. And then when they came home and they had the party, so it was, you know, there's the party with the fireworks. And the older son got angry and he became like a tiger.
Oh,
Ooh.
So that's where I went. So.
wow.
Yeah.
I like that in yours, the father is the party as well.
Yeah.
He doesn't just throw the party, he is the party.
He's become the party, absolutely. And that's perfectly. I chose well, I must say. Not on purpose, but yeah, turned out for the best.
Because I had the son bowing face down to his father, feeling really humbled. And he felt as if he couldn't look at his father's face because he felt naturally ashamed and, you know, realized what he's done, you know. But yet his father is still there waiting with open arms for him, still loving him and accepting him. It doesn't matter what he's done, he still loves him. And then the older brother, now this time his back is on everybody and he's gone off angry and feeling betrayed. And yeah, so he's the one now, his back's on everybody, on the family. So yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I love how every single one is different and every single one shows us something new about the story. So when the father heard what his older son said, he turned to him and he said, "My son, whatever I have is yours. You haven't lost anything. You still have all of the inheritance that you were going to get. But how could we not rejoice today when your lost brother has been found again?" That is how God rejoices, Jesus said, when someone is sorry and comes home. And the people who heard this story from Jesus wondered what it meant. And that's our story. So some of the things that I have tried to demonstrate some possibilities there. I saw this technique called a bibliologue, where you stop at different points throughout. And the way it was done live was that the storyteller had chairs, and each chair had a character's name on it. And we sat in a circle around the chairs, and you were invited to come up at different points and move the chairs to how you wanted them to be. So the way I've recreated that online is having you each have your own little separate one that you're doing throughout. So that's just a very simple way that something done in person can be adapted to suit Zoom. What I like about doing it on Zoom is that everyone has a chance to do it, but you don't have to do it publicly. So if you have an idea in the in-person version, but you're kind of nervous to get up and move the chairs around and explain, then you can't do anything. Whereas if you've got your own little set at home, you can still do it privately and explore that way. I'm going to share the screen again. So there we have, that's the painting that I found for this story, which I think is absolutely brilliant. So some of the principles that I tried to include in this, because I was telling the story, so I was being a presenter, I was sharing the story with an audience, but I asked open-ended questions, so I wasn't putting an interpretation on it. You could still come up with your own different thoughts and your own different ideas, and we didn't have to agree. There wasn't one right answer. And wondering questions are great for that. They're also great for mixed age groups, because you can then differentiate just by the way they answer without you having to do any extra work. A 2-year-old will answer in a 2-year-old way and a 10-year-old in a 10-year-old way, and you've just asked the same question. I tried to provide a way for the listeners to engage, so you weren't just sitting at home being talked at like you are right now. You were moving your figures, you were doing your thing, so you had a way of occupying your hands and being involved in the story, even though we were on Zoom. Setting up the storytelling space, again, making it well lit, making it sort of separate, so it's, you know, you're entering the world of the story. not making my face the vast majority of what you're looking at there. So the focus is on the story and people can see it well. And because we're sort of limited in time, I was also trying to demonstrate at the same time some way that children can be empowered as storytellers. So you were the children there. And the method that I was sort of modeling with pausing each time and asking you to show what you were doing and explain and then have us ask questions about it, is that we give children a structure for telling their stories. Because sometimes just tell this story in whatever way you want can be kind of intimidating. So we have them build their story. And that can be with Legos, it can be a drama, it can be making a video, it can be whatever way they're comfortable with building their story. So we build your story. And it can be just one who's telling it to a group, where they can all build their own and take turns telling. And then we tell the story. So when I stopped and asked you to explain your model, that was kind of a way of you telling your story. Though if we were doing a child as storyteller as the main thing, you would have been telling the whole story instead of me. And then the group asks questions about the story. So you can say what you like about it, which many of you did. You can ask a question, which I think we had a few of those. So why have you chosen to do this? Why did you decide that? Why did you use this color Lego? Why did you have the son facing away from the father? So you're asking questions of the story. You're not asking the storyteller, you're asking the story, if that makes sense. And that can give children a structure and a framework for building confidence in telling stories. So you build the story, you tell the story, and then the group asks questions about the story. Obviously, as with all things, there need to be ground rules so that it can be a safe experience. No interrupting. Could be helpful to have a time limit on storytelling, because we all know that one child who, if you give them a chance to just tell a story, you're going to be there 20 minutes later on some long tangent that has to do with something that happened to them when they were 3 that may or may not actually have happened, and you're all stuck there listening to it. So you can provide a time limit. One way that can work is you have a yellow card when there's 1 minute left and a red card when they have to finish, and you just hold those up at the predetermined time. And you explain that at the start so that they know. And the questions have to be about the story. So you can't jump in to correct them. You can't say you did that bit wrong. You can't say you picked the wrong doll to be Jesus. You have to ask, why did you choose that doll to be Jesus? And then respect their answer for that. This is all based on Lego Serious Play. So if you have a chance to learn more about Lego Serious Play, this is just a very, very small snapshot of what it can do. It's a method for thinking creatively and using metaphor and story, often in corporate settings, to encourage creative thinking and playfulness. But it can be used in so many ways, and it can empower us to be storytellers and empower children to be storytellers. So I was going to send people to breakout rooms, but I don't think we have to do that. I think we can just talk among us. For about 5 minutes, think of a story or a book that meant a lot to you as a child. You don't have to participate in this conversation. It seems on its surface a very sweet, easy, simple question, but often stories are how we survive traumatic experiences. And so if that is your childhood, then this can be actually a very fraught question and a very difficult one. So nobody has to participate who doesn't want to. But if we can think about a story that meant a lot to us as a child, and what that story meant to you and what makes it special. So I read the Narnia books over and over as a child. And I read time travel books over and over as a child. And I just loved the idea that there were other worlds and other times just kind of waiting there for us to find them, and that this world wasn't the whole story, that there was magic out there. That meant an enormous amount to me. So, anyone else?
Yeah, I was going to say The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That we're in the same, on the same wavelength. The reason why is my godmother actually gave the book. She always seemed to give me the most beautiful illustrated books for birthdays and Christmas, and so that particular one is it's almost a graphic novel, but the most amazing illustrations for The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And I got it, I must have been about 8 or something like that, and it's one of the books that, well, my parents brought from South Africa over, so I've still got it, and it's in the most beautiful condition. And surprisingly, it's kept my 4-year-old's attention, even though it's more appropriate for, well, yeah, the story is actually, and the style in which it's written is more appropriate for a child maybe a bit older, but she loved it, and she still speaks about it. So I was able to share that with her. So yeah, that's mine.
I remember reading it to my sister's 10 years younger than I am, and she was about 8, so I was probably at uni my first year, and I read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe to her, a chapter a night over the summer. And she absolutely lost it when Aslan died. She was inconsolable. She was sobbing, and I had to read an extra chapter to show her that he came to life again, and it was all going to be okay.
Yes, that scene is quite, with young children, what their understanding and their experience of it. I must say, my daughter was showing my mum on the Facebook Live or Messenger or whatever it is. She was going through it, and she went through and she showed her the scary pictures with all the goblins, and he said, "But don't worry, look here." Turns over the page, and there's this beautifully, bright picture of Aslan come back to life. Just the difference between one page and the other page in tone is just amazing. So yeah, I also had to continue, couldn't stop there, otherwise it would be too traumatic.
Absolutely.
But it's great to be able to give that story of good news, isn't it? And say, actually, doesn't end there, don't worry, there's something amazing going to happen. Yeah, that's one.
A book that I absolutely adored growing up and still do now is To Kill a Mockingbird. I think it's a wonderful story, but every time I read it, there's just something different comes to the fore. And there's a particular part, I think I must have read it leading up to Christmas one time. It's probably when I was doing my GCSEs or something, but it's always like my go-to end of November read. And there's this bit where they're going towards school and they've got like the Christmas play, and it always brings me back to like me being in year 4, my lower school, and like, I remember getting all excited and dressed up with my family and going, anxious to perform, but then it's all fine. So that's one that's kind of always stays with me.
Wasn't she dressed as a ham though, or something?
So
I like the book Pollyanna, because I remember it just being there was some sadness in it, and she got really upset, and yet at the same time, then she was always such a positive person all the time, and so much always finding the positive, and then she had that sadness that came in, but then how she pulled through at the end. And I think I remember loving that book. And then I obviously lost, I think, when leaving home, and that books got passed on and I never got them back. And then I remember as an adult buying the book when I was living in London and reading it every morning on the tube on the way to work. And just it's made me think I must go back and read it again. Actually, I must go find it on the bookshelf and pull it out again and read. Because I always find things like that inspiring. Like when things look bleak, it's nice to have a glimmer of hope. I think that's what it gives me, And I know even as an adult, I remember reading the book and starting a glad thought book and writing every day 2 or 3 things that I was glad and thankful for. And it was based on back to that Pollyanna book. I remember that left quite an impression on me, to try and find the positives in things in life, because life will have its ups and downs. Yeah.
So some very profound things, books giving us tools for getting through tough times and tools for coping with our emotions. Books showing us magical other worlds, books showing us that death isn't the end and there's this wonderful turning the page and something else has happened. Books that connect very strongly to sensory memories of our own childhoods and our own lives and reflect our experiences of going to school and looking forward to the play. And we see that in the book, and we realize, you know, that experience is common. We're not the only one who's had that. Something I mentioned earlier about the person who reads us the story or who tells us the story. Robin, you said it was your godmother gave you the book, so there's that relationship there. Something that's come up occasionally when I've asked this question is people saying there was a character who reminded me of me, and I saw myself in that book, or someone who had my name, and that, you know, I could relate to that character. So stories have an enormous power. And then there was a study done at the University of British Columbia, and my share screen thing is not showing PowerPoint. Hang on a second. Show all windows. So there was a study done, and this seems unrelated at first, but it does come back. A study done into youth suicide rates in Canadian First Nations communities. And anthropologists explored youth suicide rates and found that among different tribal councils, the rates vary from basically nothing, so almost 0 per 100,000, up to 63 youth suicides per 100,000. And so, of course, when you see data like this, the next question is to ask why. What makes the difference between these incredibly low and incredibly high rates of young people feeling that life is not worth living and there's no point in going on? And this is the bit where I just read out loud from a slide, and it's a bit dull, but I felt that the actual words were so well put together that I couldn't improve on them. They found that young people from high suicide communities didn't have stories to tell about their lives. They had no clear sense of their past, their childhood, of the generations preceding them. When the young people did have stories to tell, continuity was already built into their sense of self by the structure of their society. Elders were respected, and the elders took on the responsibility of teaching children who they were and where they had come from. The language and customs of the tribe had been preserved conscientiously over the decades. And so the youths saw themselves as part of a larger narrative in which the stories of their lives fit and made sense. So stories have an incredible power, and particularly the stories of who we are as a community and how our lives fit into that story and how that story connects to our traditions and rituals and ways of being and doing. That can literally be life-saving. And the ways that communities pass on those stories to children and young people and allow them to claim them as their own can be life-saving. And anyone who's my age, again, will have seen this film probably at some point in your life. The Princess Bride, a grandfather passing on a story that he loves to his grandson. This is a special book. It was the book my father used to read to me, and I used to read it to your father, and today I'm going to read it to you. And the grandson asks, does it have any sports in it? That's what he cares about. And the grandfather says, are you kidding? Fencing, fighting, torture, revenge, giants, monsters, chases, escapes, true love, miracles. And the grandson says, it doesn't sound too bad. I'll try and stay awake. And looking this over for about the 50th time in my life, I realized actually this whole dialogue could be about reading the Bible, including all the stuff about there being true love, miracles, revenge, giants, monsters, chases, escapes in the Bible. There's incredibly dramatic stuff in there. And it was the book my father used to read to me, and I used to read it to your father, and today I'm going to read it to you. So you're passing it on, like the elders in those First Nations communities, taking on the responsibility of passing on the community's stories to the young people. So the stories that we read as children have an immense power. We remember them. They help us make sense of the world. They give us the tools we need to cope with our emotions. They connect to our own lives and experiences. They show us that there's magic and hope out there. But when we're passing along stories of the faith, they also have this incredible power to tell us who we are and where we come from, and connect us to what Sandra Miller calls the vertical community. When she's talking about baptisms and weddings and funerals, very often people want to do it in the church where their grandparents did that, because we have that vertical community. We're coming up to All Saints and All Souls Day, for all the saints who from their labors rest, the great cloud of witnesses, the saints who nobly fought of old, the ones who came before us. The Bible stories connect us to that, show us the role that our lives have in that bigger story. So all of that is very grand and theoretical. And so how do we do that well? How do we evaluate which children's Bibles we should spend money on? Because some of them are pretty expensive. How do we evaluate storytelling materials and say which ones we should use and which ones we shouldn't? You may have read Rebecca Nye's excellent book, Children's Spirituality, What It Is and Why It Matters. It can be read in an afternoon. It's an excellent guide to what spirituality is and the conditions it needs to flourish. And one of the key things she talks about is trust. We trust the child. We trust that the child is doing the work of interpreting the story, and that they're doing that with integrity, and that we don't need to do it for them. We can give them the story and they can make meaning from it with our help and facilitation, but not doing it for them. To trust God, trust that God is working in these children's lives, and to trust the story, that the story has power. We don't need to treat the story as, we don't need to treat Bible stories as if they're vegetables we have to sneak into children's diets before they realize they're getting them. We don't have to pretend that God isn't there, or that Jesus isn't there, or that they're not a part of the story. We don't have to dress it up with all kinds of bright colors and loud noises as the key attraction. If they're appropriate to add bright colors and loud noises, great, but that by itself isn't needed, because the story has power of its own, and we can trust that. There is no child who, in hearing the story of the Red Sea, doesn't catch their breath when they realize that the sea is in front of them and their enemy is behind them and they can't go forward and they can't go back. That is a spine-chilling moment in and of itself. We don't need to jazz it up to get them interested. If we tell the stories honestly, they will be interested. So we can trust the story. Gretchen Wolfe Pritchard, who happens to be my mother and who also wrote a book called Offering the Gospel to Children, she uses the metaphor of a gift. Very often when adults tell Bible stories, we get really, really worried about whether children will get the message, whether they'll get the moral. And so instead of telling the story as a story, we simply tell the story as sort of gift wrap around a moral. So we want them to get out of this story, something about being kind to others. So we say, here's the story. And what does the story mean? It means we should be kind to others. What does it mean, children? And they all have to say, be kind to others. And then they have to answer 10 questions about being kind to others. And then they have to memorize a memory verse about being kind to others. And by that point, we've just bashed them over the head with this moral, which we put in the wrapping paper of the story, that they've just thrown out the wrapping paper. They've decided they've understood what the teacher wants from this story, which is about being kind to others, and they don't need it anymore. So they chuck out the wrapping paper, which is the story. Whereas if the story itself is the gift, if we equip them to take it out and play with it over and over and to keep coming back to it, they won't need to chuck it out, because it's not about finding the right moral for adult approval. It's about the story itself being something that we give them to play with and keep exploring and keep making meaning about. And those of you who are saying you keep reading these children's books that you loved as a child, and you keep reading them as an adult, I bet you find something new every time you go back. That story is not finished when you've read it once or twice or 10 times. And the same is true with Bible stories. They're not going to be done by the time the child walks out of your session. But if you've told it with integrity and wonder, that child will keep coming back to that story and playing with it. And that leads me into what I was about to say, which is that it's open-ended. Again, we get really anxious about making sure they've got it by the end of our session. I imagine this is especially true in schools where there's more of a regulatory framework, and we have to prove that certain things were accomplished. And we can do that, but we also need to leave space for the work not to be done. No adult is done, thinking about the sermon, if they've been listening to it, by the time they walk out of church. They'll think about the sermon all week if it was a good one and if they were paying attention. And they'll keep thinking about it and keep coming back to it. And for children, they'll be playing with it and they'll be wondering about it. And that is lifelong work. It's not done by the end of one session or the end of 1 year or the end of primary school. And so being okay with it being open-ended and sending them out going, you know what, we're going to keep wondering about this story. We're going to keep playing with it. And that's okay, because the story is yours. It belongs to you. And you can do with it what you will. Space for awe and wonder. So it's not just factual. It's not just about getting it right. It's not about reading comprehension and answering questions. It's about standing in the presence of something bigger than ourselves and going, wow. That's what time travel and magic stories did for me as a child. It created that awe and wonder, that sense of something bigger than me, of something better than the world around me. When we're looking at visual elements in videos, in children's Bibles, the richness of the imagery and the symbolism, really important. Lois Rock does a lot of good Bibles for under 5s where the illustrations are simple but not simplistic. There's a lot there. Very often children's visual vocabulary is just a nativity scene across an angel and a heart, and providing them with a broader array of symbols through illustrations or videos or whatever you use, so that they can express biblical concepts with pictures, which is often a vocabulary they're more comfortable with. So you get the water and the well and the rainbow and the boat and the city and the mountain and the desert and all of that stuff. How well is that portrayed? Also, is everyone in this children's Bible white? Because they weren't. They were not. The Romans were the closest to Europeans that we get in the whole Bible. So if we just give children blonde Jesus over and over, we're showing them that that's the only way to look like God. That's the only way to look like a Christian. Desmond Tutu has a Bible called the Children of God Storybook Bible, where they get like 35 illustrators from around the world to do different stories. And they all reflect their own backgrounds. So that's also something to think about. What are we consciously or unconsciously showing children about what God and God's people look like? And are they included? Are the stories sort of played for lols? There is space for sacred humor. We don't have to be, I'm American, I would say po-faced here. I don't know how well that translates. We don't have to be po-faced. We don't have to be rigid and solemn all the time. We can laugh, that's fine. But is every story played for laughs? Because that shows a lack of trust in the story. If you have to turn it into a comedy act, then you don't trust the story to stand on its own. Is this resource okay with stories that look at the big questions? You know, can Jesus weep by Lazarus's tomb in this Bible? Or is it played for laughs that he's going to stink after 4 days? Can Jesus die on the cross and rise again and defeat death? Or is it somehow going to be glossed over and, oh, we're not really going to talk about that? Is there space for the big questions of life? Or are we so uncomfortable that we have to laugh it off? So those are questions we can ask when we come to Bibles, when we come to videos, when we come to any storytelling resource. I would also add, this is not quite story, but is there something other than narrative in this children's Bible? Is there psalm? Is there prophecy? Are there, you know, some sign of what the laws were? Because yes, story is hugely important, but the Bible also has other genres, and does this Bible reflect that? So this was my thing for if we had a ton of time at the end. I was going to have us talk about this because I'm always anxious about running out of material and having nothing to talk about. And then I never do. I always end up needing to gloss over at the end. So I'm just going to pose these questions for us to think about. This is a story we all know very well. And it's a story that's very, very short. It's only a few verses. And it's one that's really accessible to children. They've all lost something. Some of them have found it again, some haven't. Most children have been lost, however briefly, at some point in their life. And that feeling of looking up and not seeing your mom or dad or nan or whomever there. So it's very accessible. So looking at this story and thinking about how we, you know, these questions we could ask about any story that we're telling. What context would you need to provide to children for this story to be better understood? For example, who's talking? Who's telling this story? Is this a story that actually happened? No, it's a parable. This is a story Jesus told. This is not a historical story of something that happened. This is Jesus talking here. So we often just don't think to provide that context because we know. But if we're telling a story from before Jesus is born, this is the story from the story, this is from the part of the story of God's people before Jesus was born. Or this is a story from Jesus's life. Or this is a story of the first churches after Jesus went up to heaven to be with God and be everywhere at once like God is. Just so they have some place to put it in a framework. But there's other contexts. They might not know what a shepherd is. They might not know what Jesus is talking about when he says your Father in heaven. So what context would you need to provide? Are there gaps in the story? Are there spaces where things are missing? Can we wonder about those gaps? Do we need to fill those gaps? Are there gaps? What does that mean? How might you tell it differently with different ages? How might you tell it online? And how would you enable children to reflect on or respond to it? And Trish, I know you were talking about this earlier with equipping parents to help with response time at home and so on. So those are some questions we can ask when approaching any story. Right, we've got a couple minutes, I think. Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes. If there are any questions, comments, any really obvious heresies that I spoke, totally open to you.
Well, I wanted to say thank you for this. This has been really good. It's been a great reminder for me because it reminded me a bit of Godly Play when I did Godly Play, you know, going back to the story and trusting the story and not giving the children all the answers or expecting it to have a moral. And I think this has been good for me because even whether it's my schoolwork or church work with the children, I'm thinking I really want to rethink some of the, obviously there's the assembly side, but I think I actually want to rethink some of the material I'm doing. I want to maybe do more like a storytelling where you get them wondering, you know, and thinking of how to do that. And I think even like the simple thing you did just now with us, with the father, you know, with the prodigal son story, was very simple props and stuff. So it doesn't have to even be very fancy, but just to engage the children in a story, get them thinking and getting their curiosity going. And so what I think for me, it's just made me think, I actually want to rethink doing some different stuff for even for schools, with the stories, to let the stories speak for themselves and allow the children to engage. But then even you said something about the children's storytelling, and I'm actually thinking maybe there's something I can do with church as well as even schools, giving the teachers the opportunity to allow the children, like in advance, if I say to them, okay, they need to have 3 props or something like we did today or something, and then letting the children then somehow the teacher, it depends on the dynamics of the class, I suppose, and how comfortable the children will feel to do this. But maybe as the teacher, maybe initially she could do it where she does a little story and gets them to do it. But then it's enabling the teacher, but enabling the children. So I want to think more about that, how to make it also fun for the teachers and the children. They can engage in a different way. Yes, it's left me with a lot of food for thought. I've got to go away and process it, I think, and think how I can make it work. And it's great because it's been a great reminder to remember the power of stories and how they're so impacting on our lives. Yeah,
I've put something in the chat, which is collective worship resources for autumn 2020 from Godly Play. Those were put together by Godly Play UK with the help of Elizabeth Sutcliffe, who is a former teacher and is also a children's worker in the Diocese of St Albans.
Yeah.
So they are absolutely excellent, as you would expect from a children's worker in the Diocese of St Albans. Because apart from the Diocese of Oxford, Robin, we have the best ones. So that's there, and that's appropriate for collective worship in the Godly Play style. And there was something else that you said that about equipping children to be storytellers in class. I was talking to a former diocesan advisor the other day, and he was talking about how, very often with writing, first you sort of build your story and then you tell your story and then you can write your story. And that's something that teachers are familiar with in literacy. Helping children get to that stage where they can write something down. So this probably connects with a lot of what they're doing with other stories in school, going from having it in your head to having it on the page and all the steps that takes.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question quickly. That the book that you mentioned that had very simple illustrations, what was that one? With the heart and the cross?
Oh, anything by Lois Rock.
Lois Rock.
Yeah. So she wrote, I just put it in the comments. She wrote my very first Bible and a lot of other ones. Really good for under 5s. Very simple illustrations, but a lot going on that you can pick up on. And everyone's various shades of tan.
Yeah, lovely. No, that sounds great. Something I do love those. To me, illustrations are quite important.
I do also have, I will very quickly get this link up. I have a Pinterest board of Bible storybooks, which I will chuck in the chat as well. There are a few that I haven't seen myself that have just been recommended to me by people. So not every single one is personally vetted, but there they are for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Cool.
One thing I was going to ask you is also like with older children, they sometimes can be a bit more self-conscious, can't they? And because the younger children, they can be, I'm not saying that older children aren't spontaneous, because I know I've seen children, when they're in the right setting and they feel secure and safe, they just blossom and come out of themselves and come out with amazing things. But I suppose what I'm trying to get at is how would you encourage or to create that kind of safe space so that they don't feel put on the spot, if you know what I'm saying? And also what kind of stories, because I suppose it doesn't really matter about the stories really, because I suppose any story, like you say, would go for any level. It's just how they engage with it. But how to make them feel secure and safe to be able to come out of themselves and not feel embarrassed. I'd as well. Yeah.
I'd suggest a couple things, and then I'll ask if Robin or Ryan has any suggestions, and I think we'll finish there because I'm aware I don't want to take up more of your time. A couple things which would largely depend on the particular personalities involved. One thing I can think of is animation. So you give them the opportunity to make something and film something that's animated on their own time and share it, so they're not in it themselves. You can use Lego stop motion animation, you can use drawings, you can use whatever, and that removes them from the spotlight a bit. If you've got somebody who's good at drama, using improv games and drama games to sort of loosen them up and create that space where experimentation is okay, and then going from that into dramatic storytelling. Again, Lego Serious Play starts with a very simple challenge. So everyone gets the same blocks that make the little Lego duck. And you have 2 minutes to see how many ducks you can make. And then you have your first simple challenge of, you know, doing a model with Lego that shows what love is to you. And then you go into the really deep stuff about, you know, what are you hoping for out of children's ministry from your church over the next 6 months? So you gradually get into it and get people feeling comfortable with the technique, and then you can get into the heavy stuff once they're kind of at home with the tools, whether those tools are their own bodies or whatever you're working with. But any other suggestions from either of you?
Yeah, I do. I like that. It's almost like an icebreaker type of thing with building a duck, something just to give them the confidence to be able to, because yeah, you'd find it very difficult to immediately go straight into the heavy stuff with anything. Yeah.
And ground rules, you know, like we talked about earlier with any kind of storytelling, ground rules. You can't make fun of stuff, you know, everybody's contribution is valid, setting those at the start.
Mm.
Definitely, and I think very much that safe space is something which is embedded over time. So if pupils, young people know that it is a safe space and it has been for some time, then you need less of the icebreaker stuff. But you know, as you mentioned, Trish, sometimes you need that kind of, I don't know, that bedding in period when you're trying something new, just to get people used to a new way of working or new ways of telling a story. And yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for giving up an evening that you could have been spending in front of the telly or reading a book or taking a bath or all three at once. And for your wisdom and your willingness to try new things, and for the work that you're all doing daily in your various contexts. You're absolutely brilliant, and I hope to see you again soon, and I hope you have a lovely weekend and take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you.
See you then.